Joining us now is European Parliament member and Fox News contributor Nigel Farage and former advisor to British Prime Minister David Cameron and also a Fox News contributor, Steve Hilton. Good to see you, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Maria.
Nigel, let me kick this off with you. What are your expectations for this meeting, number one?
Well, of course, the personalities are remarkably different, but there are shared interests. And I was delighted with Theresa May's speech last night because she's now embraced the fact that Brexit means we can start to do things with the rest of the world, starting with the USA. And yeah, you know, she was positive when it came to talking about trade, about cooperation on dealing with terrorism, on thinking about where NATO goes from here. So look, I think everything's set fair. I really do. Steve
Hilton, how do you see it? What would you like to see come out of this? A trade deal, bilateral?
Well, I agree with what Nigel just said, but I think the really interesting thing here is that although in a way it's Britain that has the most to gain from a trade deal, because we really need to show that Brexit is good for jobs and the economy, as Nigel and I argued, the fact is that it seems that Trump might be more eager to get on with it than the British. And the reason is that the EU rules actually say that if you're going to a country that wants to leave the EU can't start negotiating until it's actually left, which is at least 2 years away. Now, that is completely ridiculous. And those rules were written, remember, by the EU when they didn't imagine that any country would have the nerve to actually leave. And they're really there to try and put countries off from leaving and punish them. So what I'd love to see is Trump say to Theresa May, look, ignore those stupid rules and the ridiculous EU bureaucrats. Let's make a deal. Let's get on with it.
Yeah.
And Steve, this is Brian Bremberg. It seems also that it's important for the United States to be able to do something with Great Britain, because we've been talking about the importance of bilateral deals, stepping away from TPP, replacing those with bilaterals. So it seems like both Great Britain and the U.S. have a strong interest in getting this done. But do you actually see the European Union getting in the way in a material way? I know you're talking about kind of bulldozing through that, but can that really stand in the way of this thing happening soon?
Well, I think that in the end, it's up to the resolve of the leaders involved. I think that this will actually be a really good test of whether the EU can do that. A lot of terms are thrown around like it's illegal and EU law says this and that. But the fact is the British people voted finally to be a self-governing country where their own laws and their own parliament comes first. And I don't see why that needs to wait until the formal process. Theresa May's made it very clear that there's no going back. The UK is going to leave, so I think that it's perfectly reasonable to just ignore those rules and start negotiating properly right now, especially when you've got a president in the White House who's really eager to get on with it.
Yeah.
Nigel, do you agree with that? Are we really, though,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, you know, actually Trump, I think is going to look in disbelief, isn't he? If she says, well, Donald, it's been a great meeting and yeah, let's get on with this. But, and I know, Donald, that you'd like to sign this, you know, at the beginning of June, but actually it could be 2 more years. I mean, Trump won't respect that very much. No, what we've got to do, Brussels have been clear. You know, I was there last week. They've been clear. They say we're not allowed. The British Prime Minister has got to stand up for our interests and say, to hell with that. Yeah. We're going to crack on. We're going to do this. After all, what can the EU do to us? Throw us out? We're leaving anyway.
That's a good point. But some members of the British Parliament are calling on Theresa May, I mean, according to reports, to stand up over Donald Trump on his torture remarks about tactics such as waterboarding might be considered legal. Does she need to respond to that, do you think?
No, because actually Trump gave a personal view. He gave a personal view, but he said he would leave it to Pompeo and to Mattis, and Mattis has virtually ruled it out already. That argument is a dead duck. And anyway, the idea that a British Prime Minister should walk into the Oval Office and start giving the President of the USA moral lectures, I don't think would be a very good starting place for this relationship.
Yeah, and it's illegal in this country anyway, period. No, it's completely illegal. And John Brennan has come out and said it worked. Remember? He actually said that on some of the terror suspects that led us to Osama bin Laden.
It is a fascinating thing. This meeting, I think, is important for a lot of reasons, and one of them is, more than anything, I think, is symbolic, to show that we're not alienated. And so I think in the U.S., you're talking about how important it is in Britain to show that there's jobs and all of that Brexit's going to work. But here, I think, to see us coming together, you know, Donald Trump meeting with such a close ally, I think it's really important that we see those kinds of things. So, you know, what is the symbolism that you guys see out of this?
Well, I think it's a really... I completely agree with what you've just said. I think it'll show that Donald Trump, contrary to what a lot of the critics have said, is able to strike really strong working relationships with foreign leaders. And I think there's a good chance that they're going to get along really well, because even though, as Theresa May herself said, you know, they're pretty much opposites. She said opposites attract. I think that the truth about Theresa May, and I don't agree with her about everything she's done since the Brexit vote, but she's really hardworking, she pays attention to detail, and she's a tough person. One of my favourite things that happened last year, Nigel will remember this, after David Cameron resigned, there was a leadership election, and one of the former cabinet ministers in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet was caught on a hot mic situation talking about Theresa May, and he said to someone else, you know, Theresa May, she's a bloody difficult woman. He said, but we worked with Margaret Thatcher, and so was she. We know what that's like. And then Theresa May picked that up and said, well, actually, as we're leaving the EU and we've got these tough negotiations, Britain needs a bloody difficult woman. And I think that actually there's a really good chance that she and Trump, despite their kind of different personalities, will get on really well.
That's good. I like that. Let me turn to immigration in the U.S. because the Trump administration reportedly planning to stop all refugee admissions for 120 days, suspend entry until further notice for Syrian refugees, certainly. And we saw issues with mass amounts of refugees coming into Germany under Merkel. Nigel, how do you see this? Do you think Trump's policy in the U.S. can help national security? Is this going to work?
Oh, yes, it certainly helps national security. And there'll be questions about how fair it is. Look, what Mrs. Merkel did was a catastrophe. You know, when we saw those horrendous massacres taking place in Paris, of the 8 people that did it, 5 had come back into the European continent pretending to be refugees. So the evidence is mounting that, frankly, what Mrs. Merkel did was to open the door to terrorism, and Trump does not want to make the same mistake, and I think he's absolutely right to be doing what he's doing.
Yeah, final word, Steve Hill. Yeah, go ahead.
She's admitted that it was a mistake, that she opened the door to terrorism, and in fact, the number of refugees let into Germany last year was down by 600,000 people. It fell from nearly 1 million by 600,000. So they have backtracked. So we're just doing essentially what Germany's trying to get its hands around a mushrooming problem, and we're just taking more advanced steps
and
to prevent terror on U.S. soil.
That was one of the issues that pushed Britain to want to leave the EU, right?
Exactly.
I mean, open borders. They can't make their own rules in their own country.
That's right, and I think that what last year showed, both in a good way with the Brexit vote and in a bad way, as Nigel said, with what Merkel did, is I hope the final nail in the coffin of this open borders ideology that has done so much damage around the world. And I think that what we can show now with Brexit and with what the President wants to do here is that there is nothing unreasonable about a country wanting to protect its borders and decide who can come in and who can't come in. And that is a reasonable idea that now I hope will be the new way of thinking about these issues all around the world.